There is a note that Johnny Carson kept in a locked drawer of his desk at NBC for 16 years. He never showed it to anyone. He never read it on air, never referenced it in any interview, never allowed it to become part of the public record of his 30 years as the host of The Tonight Show. He found it in his dressing room on January 29, 1977, the day after Freddie Prinze died. It was folded in half and written in the handwriting of a 22-year-old man who had been in that dressing room 2 months before. Sitting across from Carson on the most important stage in American television, making everyone in the building laugh so completely and so helplessly that Carson himself forgot for a few minutes that he was supposed to be the host. What the note said has never been made public, but what Carson told a small number of people about it, in conversations that were private and that were held close for years, reveals something about the weight of seeing something in someone and not saying what you see, and about the specific grief of a mentor who understands too late what the person he was mentoring had been trying to tell him. This is that story. Before we go there, I need to ask you to do something. I see in the comments every week that some of you have been watching these stories for months without realizing you are not subscribed to this channel. Please take 10 seconds right now and check. It is free. It changes nothing about your life except that the next story will find you when it's ready. Thank you for being here. Now let us start at the beginning. Because before there was a note in a locked drawer, there was a young man from Washington Heights who walked onto the Tonight Show stage for the first time in 1973, at 19 years old, and in 4 minutes turned Johnny Carson into the most enthusiastic audience he had ever performed for. And before that, there was a childhood that had produced the particular kind of comedy that only comes from people who have been using laughter as a survival tool since before they fully understood what survival required. Frederick Karl Prutzel was born on June 22, 1954, in the Manhattan neighborhood of Washington Heights, to a Hungarian immigrant father named Karl Prutzel and a Puerto Rican mother named Maria. He grew up in an apartment on 175th Street in conditions that were not poverty, in the most extreme sense, but were close enough to it that the distance between what his family had and what they needed was always present and never invisible. His father worked. His mother worked. He was the child between two cultures and fully of neither, which is a specific kind of childhood loneliness that does not have a simple name, but that tends to produce in certain people a very particular skill, which is the ability to read a room and find the angle from which to enter it that makes the room receptive rather than hostile. He found comedy young, the way people find the thing that is going to save them, not gradually but all at once in the specific moment when the full nature of what they have stumbled onto becomes clear. He was 13 years old the first time he made a room of strangers laugh deliberately, and the sensation that produced in him was so distinct from anything he had felt before that he spent the next 6 years in single-minded pursuit of the conditions under which he could produce it again. He was not a good student in any traditional academic sense. He was a brilliant observer of people, of the space between what people said and what they meant, of the physical and verbal rhythms that made certain kinds of speech funny and certain kinds not. He had a gift for voices, for physicality, for the particular timing that could not be taught and had to be discovered through live performance in front of real audiences who were not predisposed to be forgiving. He performed wherever anyone would let him perform. He was relentless. He was, by the time he was 19, already one of the most promising young stand-up comedians in New York, generating the kind of word of mouth that eventually finds its way to the people whose attention can change a career in a single evening. But what nobody who saw him perform in those early years could fully account for, what made his act something more than simply very funny, was a quality in his performance that went beyond technique and into something more fundamental. He made the audience feel that what he was telling them about his life was true. Not literally true necessarily, but true in the way that matters in comedy, which is that the feeling inside the joke was real. The recognition inside the joke was real. The specific texture of the experience the joke was built from was real. He was performing autobiography at 19, the way only the people who have something to say about what their life has been can perform autobiography. with the confidence of someone who knows the material from the inside and trusts that the inside is the right place to start. And on the night of December 6, 1973, he walked out onto the Tonight Show stage for the first time, 19 years old, wearing a suit that he had borrowed from a friend because he did not own a suit that was appropriate for national television. And in 4 minutes, he gave what Johnny Carson later called the best first appearance by a young comedian he had ever witnessed in 12 years of hosting the show. Johnny Carson's opinion of talent was not casually offered. He had been watching performers for his entire adult life with the specific attention of a man who understood from personal experience what separable things technique and instinct were, and who could tell very quickly which of them a given performer was primarily drawing on. He had introduced thousands of comedians from behind that desk, had given more careers their first national exposure than any other figure in American entertainment, and had developed over those years a kind of triage system for what he was seeing, a rapid sorting of performers into those who were very good at what they did, and those who were doing something that could not be categorized so simply. Freddie Prinze was in the second category from the first joke he told. Carson watched from behind the desk with the full attention he rarely gave to first-time guests in the opening minutes of an appearance, because most performers needed time to settle, to find the frequency of the room and adjust to it, and the patience required for that process was something Carson had developed into a professional practice. Freddie did not need time. He was on frequency from the first sentence, as though the room and the audience and the cameras and the host were simply the continuation of a conversation he had been having for years. He was funny in the way that the best comedians are funny, which is to say that the laughter he produced was not simply a response to the jokes, but a response to the person telling them, to the quality of recognition that makes an audience feel that someone is telling them the truth about something they already knew, but had not yet found words for. Carson laughed 3 times in those 4 minutes. Genuine laughter, the kind that moved his whole body, and that he was unable to fully suppress even behind the desk. And that was, by any measure, a remarkable thing for a first-time guest to produce in a man who had been performing professional composure for 12 years. When the segment ended and the commercial break began, Carson did something he did not do often, and that the production staff noted with surprise. He walked around the desk. He walked to where Freddie Prinze was standing near the curtain, preparing to leave the stage, and he put his hand on Freddie's shoulder. What he said has been reported in different versions over the years, but the version that is most consistent across the accounts of the people who were close enough to hear it is this. He said, "You are going to be enormous. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Freddie Prinze was 19 years old and standing on the most important stage in American entertainment, being told by the most important person in American late night that everything he had been working toward was actually going to happen. He laughed. He made a joke about it, because that was what he did with large feelings, converted them into something that could be released through laughter rather than held. Carson smiled. The commercial ended, but what nobody in the building that night knew was that the moment was going to last a very short time, and that the distance between that first appearance and the last one was going to be only 3 years, and that the weight of everything that happened in those 3 years was going to sit in a dressing room one November night in a note folded in half, and Carson was not going to find it until it was too late for the finding to be anything other than a different kind of grief. Wait. Because what happened in those 3 years, between the first appearance and the last, is the part of this story that nobody has told in full, and it begins with a television series and the specific weight of becoming something you were not sure you were ready to be. Chico and the Man premiered on NBC on September 13, 1974. Freddie Prinze was 20 years old. The series, which starred Freddie as a young Chicano man working for a cantankerous Anglo garage owner, played by Jack Albertson, became one of the most watched shows on American television almost immediately, drawing audiences that network executives had not predicted, and generating a response from Latino communities across the country that went well beyond the usual metrics of television success. For millions of young people from backgrounds similar to Freddie's, Seeing someone who looked and sounded and moved like them on a major network television show in a leading role was something that had not happened before in that way. At that scale, with that level of mainstream visibility, the responsibility that came with that visibility was something that Freddie Prinze felt, with a weight that most people around him did not fully understand. He was funny about it, because he was funny about everything. But underneath the humor was a seriousness that those closest to him recognized as genuine and sometimes consuming. He was 20 years old, and he was the most visible Latino entertainer in the country. And he had been famous for less than a year, and he was trying to do all of that while also being 20 years old in New York, and then Los Angeles, which is its own particular difficulty under any circumstances. He was making more money than his family had ever seen. He was working constantly. He was moving between a public life that required a continuous performance of a very specific version of himself, and a private life in which he was figuring out who he was independent of that performance, which is a problem that is genuinely difficult for anyone, and nearly impossible for someone doing it at the speed and scale and visibility at which Freddie was doing it. He began using Quaaludes, not immediately, and not as a fully conscious decision, but in the incremental way that things begin when someone is looking for a way to make the space between the performance and the person slightly more bearable. It helped at first. It helped the way these things always help at first, by softening the edges of the gap, by making the transition between the public self and the private self less abrasive. And then it helped in the way these things eventually do not help, by making the gap wider, by making the private self less accessible, by replacing the problem it was supposed to solve with a version of itself that could not be solved the same way. The people around Freddie who saw this happening were not always sure what to do with what they were seeing. He was young and successful, and surrounded by people whose professional interests were served by his continued availability and good performance, and the machinery of a television career in full swing is not well designed to accommodate the private difficulties of the person at its center. He appeared on The Tonight Show several more times in 1975 and 1976. He was always funny. He was always on. Carson always enjoyed him, always gave him the full attention and the genuine warmth that he reserved for performers he both admired and liked. But Carson was also watching, and in the particular way that Carson watched people, which was the way of someone who had spent 30 years learning to see past the performance to the person doing the performing. He was beginning to see something that he did not yet have a name for, something in the quality of Freddie's energy in those later appearances that was different from the quality he had seen in 1973. Not worse, exactly. Not less funny, something else, something that manifested in particular moments, in the fractional pause between a joke and the next thought, in a quality of the eyes in the moment, after the audience laughed, that went somewhere private very quickly, and was visible only if you were looking at precisely the right moment. Carson was looking. He did not say what he was seeing to anyone. He had not yet decided whether what he was seeing was what he thought it was, or whether it was the imagination of someone who was projecting concern onto a young man who was doing fine and who needed nothing from the host of the show except a chair and a microphone and the same warmth he extended to everyone. He kept watching, and on the night of November 18, 1976, the last night Freddie Prinze came to The Tonight Show, Carson made a decision during the commercial break that he would spend the rest of his life unable to fully forgive himself for. He decided not to say anything, not yet. He told himself there would be another time. He told himself the moment wasn't right. He told himself a lot of things in the 90 seconds of that commercial break that were true enough to be convincing and not true enough to be honest. And then the cameras came back on, and Freddie was funny, and the audience laughed. And the night ended the way nights on The Tonight Show ended, in applause and warmth, and the particular forward momentum of live television that makes everything feel like it is going somewhere good. The evening of November 18, 1976 had begun the way all of Freddie's Tonight Show appearances began, which was with the kind of energy that the production staff had come to associate with his name specifically, a quality of electric readiness that was distinct from other guests' pre-show states. He arrived early. He sat in the makeup chair and talked to the makeup artist with the easy warmth he always had for people who were not part of the television machinery, people who were simply doing their work and wanted nothing from him except a steady head and a good conversation. He talked about his son. Freddie Prinze Jr. had been born in March of that year, and the fact of him, the reality of a 7-month-old child who was entirely his, seemed to be the thing that Freddie's face and voice most fully opened around when it came up in conversation. He talked about him with a quality of wonder that was not performed, that was simply the specific amazement of a young father who is still in the first year of understanding what parenthood actually is. He talked about wanting to be the father his son needed. He said this to the makeup artist quietly, not as a television statement but as a private thought that had found its way into words. He went out on the stage and he was everything he always was. Brilliant and quick and generous and physically committed to every bit. The kind of performer who makes the people watching feel that what they are receiving has been thought about and felt about and built with care. Carson asked him about the baby. Freddie's face did the thing it did when the baby came up. The full open thing, the real thing underneath all the performance. He said his son had his eyes and he wasn't sure whether to be proud or sorry about that. The audience laughed. Carson laughed. And in the fractional pause after the laughter settled, Carson saw it again. The thing he had been seeing in the later appearances. The quality in Freddie's eyes in the moment after the room laughed. The quick movement toward somewhere private. It lasted perhaps a second. Then Freddie was back, fully present, fully performing, fully giving the audience everything they had come for. The commercial break came. Carson sat behind the desk with his notes, which he did not look at. He was thinking about what he had just seen. The floor manager was counting down. 30 seconds, 20. Carson looked toward the curtain where Freddie was visible in the wing, talking to a production assistant, laughing at something the assistant had said. 15 seconds. Carson picked up his pen. Put it down. Looked at the curtain again. 10 seconds. He made his decision. He told himself it was fine. The cameras came back on. After the show, Freddie went to Johnny's dressing room to say goodbye, the way he usually did, because Freddie was the kind of person who said goodbye properly, who understood that the ends of things deserved acknowledgement. They talked for a few minutes. Freddie was warm and funny, and gave no external indication of anything that needed to be addressed. He left. Carson changed out of his suit jacket. He sat for a moment in his dressing room before leaving for the night. He was reaching for his jacket to hang it up when he saw the piece of paper on the edge of his dressing table. Folded in half, his name written on the outside in handwriting he recognized. He picked it up. He stood there in his dressing room with the note in his hand and he looked at it for a moment. He put it in his jacket pocket without opening it. He told himself he would read it later. He went home. He did not read it that night. He did not read it the following morning. He had a show to prepare. He put the jacket in the closet. The note was in the pocket. He did not think about it every day. He thought about it some days. He told himself he would read it when he had a quiet moment. He never had the quiet moment, or he had the quiet moment and chose something else to do with it. He would spend the next 2 months not reading the note that was in the pocket of a jacket in his closet, and he would spend the next 16 years unable to stop thinking about that. January 28, 1977. Carson was in his office at NBC preparing for that evening's show when his assistant knocked on the door. The look on her face was the specific look that precedes news that cannot be softened by any amount of professional composure. She said there had been a call from the hospital. She said Freddie Prinze had been taken to UCLA Medical Center early that morning. She said it was serious. Carson set down his coffee. He asked what had happened. She told him. He sat in his office for a long time after she left, not moving, not reaching for the phone, not doing any of the things that the machinery of a working day required him to do. At 1 p.m., Freddie Prinze was pronounced dead. He was 22 years old. His son was 10 months old. Johnny Carson canceled the broadcast that evening. This was, by the count of the people who had been working with him for years, only the second time in the history of his Tonight Show tenure that he had canceled a broadcast for a reason connected to personal grief rather than illness or institutional necessity. He went home. He sat in the room of his house where he did his private thinking, the room that was not for guests and was not for public performance, and was simply the room where he was himself, when there were no cameras and no audience, and no professional persona required. He stayed there for a long time. Then he remembered the jacket. He went to the closet. He took out the jacket. He put his hand in the pocket. The note was still there, folded in half, his name written on the outside in Freddie Prinze's handwriting. He sat down. He unfolded it. He read it. He read it a second time. He set it on the table beside him and looked at it for a long time without touching it. What was in the note has never been made public in full, and will not be made public here, because some things belong to the people who held them. But what Carson told a small number of people about it over the years amounts to this. Freddie had written that he was grateful, that he wanted Carson to know that the night in December of 1973, when Carson had put his hand on his shoulder at the edge of the curtain and said what he said, had been the night that made him believe the whole thing was actually possible. He wrote that there were not many people in his life who had believed in him before they had any particular reason to, and that Carson had been one of them, and that he had never found the right moment to say so directly. He wrote that he was having a hard time lately, without specifying the nature of the hard time, without naming what it was or asking for anything about it. He wrote that sometimes the hard time felt heavier than he could account for, and that he wanted someone to know. He signed it with his name, and then, below his name, he added a postscript. The postscript was 3 words. Carson told one person what those 3 words were, and that person kept the information close for many years. What they said was, "Don't worry, Johnny." And those 3 words were what sat in the locked drawer in Carson's desk at NBC for the 16 years that followed, because they were the 3 words that revealed, in a way that nothing else could have revealed it, that Freddie Prinze had known. He had known that Carson had seen something that night. He had known that Carson had been watching, and in leaving those 3 words, he had released Carson from the obligation of saying the thing aloud, had given Carson the exit that Carson had been looking for in the commercial break, and in doing so had taken from Carson the one thing that might have changed what happened next, the permission to speak. What Carson carried after that January is not something that was easy to see from the outside, because Johnny Carson carried things the way he carried almost everything personal, which was inwardly and with great professional composure, and with only the faintest occasional indication in the quality of certain silences that there was more to the interior than the exterior suggested. He returned to the show. He was professional. He was funny. He was present for the audience the way he had always been present, with the full force of what he was and what he had built over the previous 14 years. But the people who worked with him closest, the people who had been beside that desk long enough to know the difference between the performing stillness and the other kind, said that something changed after January of 1977. Not visibly, not in any way that could be pointed to directly, but the way he looked at young guests changed. The way he listened changed. The particular quality of his attention in moments when a guest seemed to be moving towards something true and stopping just before they got there changed. He began, in the months and years that followed, to ask a certain kind of question more often than he had before. Not the show business questions, not the questions about projects and performances and the machinery of celebrity, but the others, the how are you really questions, the what are you not saying questions, the questions that create the space for the answer that is harder to give and more necessary to hear. He did not explain this change to anyone. He did not attribute it publicly to anything specific, but the people who were watching, the people who had been in that building long enough to understand what they were seeing, understood. Something had happened that had changed what Carson believed his job required of him. It had changed his understanding of what the desk was for, and what the chair across from it was for, and what the conversation between the two was actually capable of being, if the person asking the questions was willing to ask the ones that mattered most, and the person answering was given enough safety to answer honestly. The desk was not for entertainment alone. It never had been. And Freddie Prinze, in a note left on the edge of a dressing table in November of 1976, had made certain that Carson would never again let himself forget that. The note stayed in the locked drawer for 16 years. When Carson retired from The Tonight Show in May of 1992, he cleaned out his office at NBC over the course of several days, going through the accumulated material of 30 years with the particular attention he had always given to the objects in his professional life. Most of what he found he sorted and archived in the way that retiring people sort and archive things, with a combination of sentiment and practical necessity. But the note he did not sort. He took it from the locked drawer and put it in the inside pocket of the suit jacket he was wearing, which was not the jacket he had been wearing that November night in 1976. He had simply put the note in a pocket, close to him, in the place where carried things go. He was 67 years old and had been hosting the most watched late-night program in American television for 30 years and was walking out of the building for the last time. And he had a piece of paper in his pocket that a 22-year-old had written in a dressing room 16 years before. And that said, in 3 words, "Don't worry, Johnny." He took it with him. He was never fully without it after that. Among the things Carson's family found after his death in January of 2005 was the note, in a small box on the shelf of his private office at home. The shelf that held the things that were not for public consumption and not for professional display. The things that belonged only to the interior life of the man himself. It was folded in half, as he had found it in his jacket pocket in the January of 1977. And on the outside was his name in the handwriting of Freddie Prinze, preserved by 28 years, and the particular care with which Carson had kept the things that could not be replaced. His family understood what it was without being told. They kept it. Some things are not for explaining. Some things are for keeping in the drawer that locks, close to the work, within reach on the days when the question of what the work is for needs an answer that transcends what any professional explanation can supply. The answer, in this case, was 22 years old, and from Washington Heights and funnier than almost anyone his age had ever been in the history of American comedy. And he had wanted someone to know he was having a hard time, and he had chosen to tell the one person he believed had been watching closely enough to understand what he meant. He was not wrong about that. He was not wrong about the watching. He was only wrong about the 3 words at the bottom. It was not nothing to worry about. It was the most important thing Carson had ever been in the room with, and it needed more than a commercial break to address it. If this story stayed with you, I want to ask you to do something before you close this video. If there is someone in your life whose eyes you have been watching, in the fractional moment after the laughter settles, in the pause between the public version and the private one, in the quality of a certain silence that tells you something more is there, say something. Don't wait for the right moment. The right moment is the moment you are in. The commercial break always ends. The cameras always come back on. And the thing you meant to say in that 90 seconds becomes the note in the jacket pocket, the note in the locked drawer, the thing you carry for 16 years that tells you what you should have said when there was still time for the saying to matter. You don't need a studio. You don't need the right words pre-assembled. You just need to ask how they are, really, and then wait long enough for the real answer to come. That is the whole job. That is what it means to be someone's Carson. Please join this channel's community if you haven't yet. The link is below. Becoming a member means being part of the group of people who believe these stories matter, who believe that what they teach us about each other is worth preserving and sharing. Tap the join button below. Please like this video so that someone else who needs to hear this tonight will find it. Subscribe so the next story reaches you. And drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from. Tell me about the person in your life who has been waiting for you to ask the real question. Tell me what you are going to do tomorrow morning. Because somewhere right now there is someone who is performing fine, who is being funny enough, and present enough, and professional enough, that everyone around them has accepted the performance as the whole story. They need someone who is watching closely enough to see the fractional pause. They need someone who will use the commercial break. Be that person. Don't find the note on the dressing table. Find the person first.